April 14, 1865. America was celebrating. After 4 years of the bloodiest war in its history, the Civil War was finally over. Church bells rang across the nation. Soldiers embraced their families. Cities filled with music, flags, and hope. For the first time in years, the United States believed peace had finally arrived. At the center of that hope stood one man, President Abraham Lincoln, a leader who had guided a divided nation through unimaginable suffering and preserved the Union when many believed it would collapse forever. But before the sun would rise again, America's greatest victory would become its darkest tragedy. Because while thousands celebrated in the streets, one man was already planning a murder that would change history forever. He wasn't a foreign spy. He wasn't a military general. He was one of the most famous actors in America. His name was John Wilkes Booth. And hidden beneath his charming smile was a plan so bold that it would shock an entire nation. Just a few hours later, inside a crowded theater, a single gunshot would silence the President of the United States. Panic would erupt. A desperate manhunt would begin. And millions of Americans would wake up to a country that would never be the same again. But one question has echoed through history ever since. How did the most powerful man in America become so vulnerable on the very night the nation believed it was finally safe? Tonight, we're going back to the final 24 hours of Abraham Lincoln's life, minute by minute, to uncover the decisions, the warnings, the missed opportunities, and the shocking events that turned a night of celebration into the night America lost its greatest president. This is the true story of Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Just 5 days before that unforgettable night, the American Civil War had effectively come to an end. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to Union General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The surrender marked the collapse of the Confederacy and gave millions of Americans something they had almost forgotten: hope. For 4 long years, the war had torn the nation apart. More than 600,000 soldiers had lost their lives, families had been divided, and entire towns had been reduced to ruins. The country was exhausted. Every victory had come at an unimaginable cost. No one understood that burden more than President Abraham Lincoln. Since taking office in 1861, Lincoln had carried the weight of a nation on the edge of collapse. He had faced military defeats, political pressure, fierce criticism, and countless sleepless nights. Yet through it all, he remained committed to one goal: preserving the Union and ending slavery. Now, with the war finally over, something about Lincoln had changed. Friends and members of his cabinet noticed that he seemed lighter, more relaxed, even hopeful about the future. He spoke openly about healing the country instead of punishing the defeated South. Rather than seeking revenge, he envisioned rebuilding a united nation where former enemies could one day become fellow citizens again. Washington, D.C., reflected that new optimism. Flags waved from buildings, bands played in the streets, and crowds celebrated the victory that many had feared would never come. But while the city celebrated peace, another story was quietly unfolding in the shadows. A man filled with anger and hatred was watching those celebrations with growing rage. To him, Lincoln was not a hero who had saved the nation. He was the man who had destroyed the South. His name was John Wilkes Booth. And by the time the celebrations ended, he had already decided that Abraham Lincoln would not live to see America's future. The morning of April 14, 1865, began like any other spring day in Washington, D.C. Warm sunlight filled the streets, and the city was still celebrating the Union's victory. For the first time in years, there was a feeling that the worst was finally behind them. Inside the White House, President Abraham Lincoln appeared unusually cheerful. His bodyguard and several members of his cabinet noticed the change immediately. The deep lines of stress that had marked his face throughout the Civil War seemed softer. He smiled more often and spoke with a sense of relief that few had seen before. That morning, Lincoln held an important cabinet meeting. During the discussion, he shared an unusual dream he had experienced several times before major events. In the dream, he found himself floating alone on a mysterious ship, moving rapidly toward an unknown destination. Lincoln admitted he couldn't explain its meaning, but those close to him later remembered the story with chilling significance. Despite the years of conflict, Lincoln's thoughts were no longer focused on war. His attention had shifted to peace. He spoke passionately about rebuilding the nation, restoring the southern states, and creating a future where Americans could move beyond hatred. His vision was not one of revenge, but of reconciliation. Later that afternoon, Lincoln decided he wanted a quiet evening with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. Friends suggested they attend a comedy performance at Ford's Theater, one of Washington's most popular entertainment venues. Lincoln agreed. It was meant to be a simple night away from politics, a rare opportunity to relax after years of unimaginable pressure. As preparations for the evening quietly began inside the White House, another man was making preparations of his own. Just a few miles away, John Wilkes Booth was finalizing a plan that would transform a peaceful night of celebration into one of the darkest moments in American history. As evening approached, John Wilkes Booth moved through Washington with a chilling sense of confidence. At just 26 years old, Booth was one of America's most recognizable stage actors. Audiences admired his talent, and theater staff knew him by name. But behind his successful career, Booth carried a deep hatred for Abraham Lincoln. He blamed the president for the South's defeat in the Civil War and believed Lincoln had destroyed the nation he loved. Months earlier, Booth had been involved in a failed plot to kidnap Lincoln. When that plan collapsed and the Confederacy surrendered, his anger turned into something far more dangerous. He became convinced that killing the president was the only way to strike back. On the afternoon of April 14th, everything seemed to fall into place. While visiting Ford's Theater, Booth learned that President Lincoln would attend the evening performance of Our American Cousin, a popular comedy. The announcement spread quickly through the theater, and Booth immediately recognized what he believed was the perfect opportunity. Because he had performed at Ford's Theater many times, Booth knew the building almost as well as the employees. He understood its hallways, staircases, backstage passages, and even the private route leading to the president's box. His familiarity with the theater gave him an advantage few others could have imagined. Throughout the afternoon, Booth quietly gathered what he needed: a small single-shot pistol and a sharp hunting knife. He also arranged for a fast horse to be waiting outside the theater, planning every detail of his escape before the first audience members had even taken their seats. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Washington remained in a festive mood. Families laughed, music echoed through the streets, and no one suspected that history was only hours away from changing forever. At the White House, Abraham Lincoln prepared for an evening of laughter. At Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth prepared for murder. At approximately 8:30 p.m., President Abraham Lincoln and First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln arrived at Ford's Theater. As they entered the presidential box, the audience erupted into applause. The orchestra paused, and hundreds of people stood to welcome the man many believed had saved the Union. The performance resumed, and laughter once again filled the theater. Hidden among the audience was John Wilkes Booth. Because he was a well-known actor, no one questioned his presence. He calmly made his way through the theater, climbed the staircase leading to the presidential box, and waited for the perfect moment, one of the play's biggest laughs, when the audience's applause would drown out any other sound. At around 10:15 p.m., Booth quietly stepped inside. He raised a single-shot pistol and fired one shot into the back of President Lincoln's head from only a few feet away. Chaos erupted instantly. Major Henry Rathbone, who was sitting with the Lincolns, lunged at Booth, but Booth slashed him with a knife before leaping from the presidential box onto the stage below. Although he injured his leg in the jump, he quickly crossed the stage and escaped through the rear exit, disappearing into the darkness on horseback. Inside the theater, panic replaced celebration. Doctors in the audience rushed to Lincoln's side. They quickly realized the wound was too severe to treat inside the theater. Carefully carrying the unconscious president across the street, they laid him in a small bedroom at the Peterson House, where cabinet members, military officers, and grieving friends gathered through the night. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton looked toward the silent room and spoke words that would be remembered forever. Now he belongs to the ages. News of Lincoln's death spread across the nation with astonishing speed. Church bells rang in mourning instead of celebration. Businesses closed. Black mourning cloth covered homes and public buildings. Millions of Americans wept openly as the country realized that, just days after winning the Civil War, it had lost the president who had guided it through its darkest chapter. John Wilkes Booth was captured 12 days later after an intense nationwide manhunt. Refusing to surrender, he was fatally shot during the confrontation. More than 160 years later, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln remains one of the defining moments in American history, a reminder that even in a moment of victory, a single act of violence can alter the course of a nation forever. The war had ended. Peace had finally arrived. But on one unforgettable night, America lost its greatest president.